Thank you for clicking in this video. Are you ready to confront the unknown? Stick around to unravel the mysteries and face the fear that hides in plain sight.
I still remember the first time I descended into the archive. The stairwell seemed endless, spiraling down into the depths of the library where light barely dared to venture. The air grew colder with each step, as if I were walking into the maw of some ancient beast. The heavy door at the bottom creaked ominously as I pushed it open, revealing the vast expanse of the underground archive. The first thing that struck me was the silence. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a silence so complete, it felt as if the very sound had been drained from the air. The walls, lined with thick shelves of old, forgotten books, absorbed every noise, every whisper. It was a place where time itself seemed to stand still, and in that silence, I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on me. The archive was an expansive maze, rows upon rows of towering shelves filled with dusty volumes that had not been touched in decades, perhaps even centuries. My job was simple, or so I had been told: catalog and organize the records that had been neglected for far too long. But as I began my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an irrational fear, I knew that, but it clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. Days passed, and I grew accustomed to the solitude. The silence, once oppressive, became a comfort, a cocoon that shielded me from the chaos of the world above. Yet, as the hours stretched into long, solitary nights, I began to notice something strange, a faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I dismissed it as the creaking of old wood, the settling of the building. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from the farthest reaches of the archive, where the oldest and most neglected records were kept. I would often catch myself straining to hear, convinced that if I listened closely enough, I could make out words. But every time I approached, the whispers would cease, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. One evening, as I was deep within the archive, lost in the task of sorting through a particularly ancient collection, I heard it again, a soft, sibilant murmur. This time, the sound was unmistakable, a voice whispering my name. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was so faint, so delicate, that I could barely distinguish the words. But it was there, calling to me from the shadows. I turned towards the source, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the shelf for support. The whispers seemed to be coming from a narrow, dimly lit aisle at the very back of the archive, a place I had rarely ventured. The air there was colder, heavier, and the darkness seemed to cling to the corners like a living thing. Despite my fear, I felt an inexplicable pull, a compulsion to follow the sound. As I made my way down the aisle, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The words were still indistinguishable, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, almost desperate. I reached the end of the aisle, where a single, dusty tome sat alone on a shelf. The book was ancient, its leather cover cracked and worn, the title faded beyond recognition. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed the cover, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a crushing void that filled the air. I stood there, my hand hovering over the book, unsure of what to do next. The urge to open it was overwhelming, but a deep, primal fear held me back. What was this place? And what secrets did it hold, buried deep within the silence of the underground? The silence that followed my encounter with the book was more oppressive than ever, a suffocating blanket that smothered any sense of normalcy. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, an overactive imagination fueled by the isolation of my work. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts like a persistent itch that refused to be scratched. I left the book where it was, retreating to the more familiar parts of the archive where the whispers didn't reach. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to focus on my work, my thoughts kept drifting back to that dark, narrow aisle. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see shadows moving at the edge of my vision. The silence, once a source of comfort, now felt like a trap, a void waiting to swallow me whole. Days passed, each one blending into the next in the dim, unchanging light of the underground. The whispers returned, sometimes so faint that I wasn't sure if I was hearing them at all, and other times louder, more distinct. They no longer confined themselves to that solitary aisle, but seemed to follow me wherever I went, like unseen eyes watching my every move. One night, as I was preparing to leave, the power suddenly went out. The lights flickered and died, plunging the archive into total darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The silence was absolute, oppressive, but then I heard it, the whispering, closer than ever before. The voice was different this time, more distinct, as if it were right beside me. It called my name, softly at first, then louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight around, illuminating the rows of shelves, but there was nothing there, only shadows. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping, drowning out my thoughts. They were coming from all directions, echoing off the walls, growing more frantic with each passing second. My name over and over again, as if the very walls of the archive were calling to me. In a panic, I stumbled towards the exit, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly as I moved. The voices followed, growing in intensity, until they were no longer whispers but desperate cries, pleading with me, urging me to turn back. I reached the stairwell and practically threw myself through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The heavy door blocked out the voices, leaving me in a silence so complete it was almost painful. My hands were shaking as I clutched the railing, trying to steady my breathing. I could still feel the echoes of those voices reverberating in my skull, a disorienting hum that refused to fade. I didn't return to the archive the next day, or the day after that. I told myself I needed time to process what had happened, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew that the silence wasn't something I could escape. It was a part of the archive, as much as the books and the dust and the darkness. And it was waiting for me. When I finally did return, I was careful to avoid the back aisles, sticking to the areas where the light was strongest, where the silence felt less oppressive. But the whispers didn't care. They found me wherever I went, growing bolder, more demanding. One evening, as I was working late, the whispers began again, louder and more persistent than ever. They were calling to me, leading me deeper into the archive, towards the shadows that waited in the depths. I tried to resist, but it was as if some unseen force was guiding me, pulling me inexorably towards that dark aisle. When I reached the end of the aisle, the whispers stopped, and I found myself standing once again before the ancient book. The silence pressed down on me like a physical weight, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The compulsion to open the book was stronger than ever, almost unbearable. With trembling hands, I reached out and touched the cover. The leather was cold under my fingers, and as I lifted the book from the shelf, a cloud of dust rose into the air, swirling in the dim light. I hesitated, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but the pull was too strong to resist. I opened the book. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, filled with spidery handwriting that was barely legible. But as I stared at the words, they seemed to shift and change, forming sentences that I could understand. The book told the stories of those who had come before me, of those who had disappeared into the silence of the underground, their fates sealed within these pages. And then I saw it, my own name scrawled across the page in that same spidery handwriting. The ink was fresh, as if it had been written only moments before. My heart froze in my chest as I realized what it meant. The archive was not just a place of silence and shadows. It was a place of memories, of stories trapped within the walls, waiting for someone to find them. And now, I was part of it. The revelation of my name in the book left me frozen in terror, staring at the page as if it were a mirror reflecting a fate I could not escape. The whispering had ceased, leaving only a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to seep into my very bones. My hands trembled as I closed the book, the dry pages rasping like a final breath. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place before the shadows claimed me too. But as I turned to go, the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. The shadows at the edge of the light grew darker, more defined, as if they were coalescing into something solid. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that I was no longer alone. There, at the far end of the aisle, something moved, a figure, indistinct and shrouded in darkness, watching me with eyes that gleamed like black pearls in the dim light. Panic surged through me, and I bolted. I raced through the narrow aisles, my footsteps echoing off the walls in a frenzied rhythm. The figure followed, its presence a cold weight pressing against my back, urging me forward. I could hear it now, a low, guttural sound, like the growl of a predator closing in on its prey. The whispers returned, swirling around me in a chaotic storm, but this time they were different, no longer calling my name, but warning me, urging me to keep running. I reached the stairwell and threw myself at the door, only to find it locked, the handle refusing to turn no matter how hard I twisted it. Desperation clawed at me as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. I turned to face the figure, which had drawn closer, its form still shrouded in darkness. It was no longer just a shadow, it was something else, something ancient and malevolent, a being born of the silence and the darkness of this place. With no other options, I fled deeper into the archive, my path a blur of twisting aisles and towering shelves. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to guide me. They spoke of hidden doors, of passages that led to safety, but the archive was a maze, and my fear clouded my thoughts. The figure was close behind, its presence a constant, creeping dread that sent shivers down my spine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a narrow gap between two shelves that I had never noticed before. Without thinking, I darted towards it, slipping through just as the figure lunged at me. The gap led to a small, cramped corridor, barely wide enough to move through, but it was a refuge, a place where the shadows couldn't reach. I pressed on, crawling through the tight space as the whispers surrounded me, their tone now more frantic, more desperate. They spoke of an exit, a way out of the archive, but it was hidden, buried deep within the labyrinth of shelves and corridors. The corridor twisted and turned, leading me further into the depths of the archive, until finally, I emerged into a small, dimly lit room. The room was empty, save for a single, ancient desk covered in dust and cobwebs. On the desk sat a large, leather-bound tome, its cover as old and worn as the book that had started this nightmare. The whispers hushed, as if waiting for me to act, and I knew that this book held the answers I sought, the key to escaping the archive and the entity that haunted it. I approached the desk cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence was thick, oppressive, and I could feel the presence of the entity just outside the room, waiting for me to make a mistake. With trembling hands, I opened the book. The pages were filled with more names, written in that same spidery handwriting, each one accompanied by a story of how they had been claimed by the archive, trapped within its silence. Some had tried to escape, only to be dragged back into the shadows. Others had succumbed to the darkness willingly, their minds unraveling under the weight of the silence. But then I saw something that gave me hope, a name I recognized, one of the archivists who had worked here before me, who had vanished without a trace. His story was different. He had found a way to save himself, to escape the clutches of the archive. The key, he wrote, was to confront the entity, to face it head-on and reclaim what it had taken. Only then could the cycle be broken, and the others, the ones who had been claimed, be freed. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The entity was feeding off the silence, trapping people in its web of fear and isolation. But if I could confront it, if I could face my own fear and reclaim the silence, I could save not only myself, but the others who had been lost to the archive. The whispers returned, softer now, as if urging me forward, guiding me towards my final confrontation. The entity was close, I could feel it, and there was no turning back. I closed the book, determination hardening in my chest. It was time to end this, once and for all. The whispers had led me to this moment, and now they fell silent, leaving me alone in the oppressive stillness of the archive. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I stood in the center of the small room, the ancient tome closed and dusty at my feet, knowing that the time for running had passed. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to free myself and the others trapped in this place, I had to confront the entity that had been stalking me through the shadows. I stepped out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked back into the labyrinth of shelves. The dim light cast long, eerie shadows across the rows of books, and every creak of the floor beneath my feet sent a jolt of fear through my spine. But I kept moving, the sense of purpose driving me forward. I could feel the entity now, closer than ever, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. It was waiting for me, its presence a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on my shoulders. As I turned a corner, I saw it, standing at the end of the aisle, shrouded in darkness. It was no longer just a shadow, it had taken form, a tall, menacing figure cloaked in the blackness of the archive. Its eyes were deep pits of darkness, and as they locked onto mine, I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. But I couldn't back down now. I had to face it, to confront the terror that had haunted me since I first set foot in this cursed place. I took a step towards the figure, and it moved in response, gliding forward with a slow, deliberate grace. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, as if alive, reaching out towards me with tendrils of darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps, but I forced myself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, until we were only a few paces apart. The whispers returned, faint and distant, urging me to speak, to break the silence that the entity thrived on. My throat was dry, and my voice trembled as I forced out the words. "What do you want?" The entity didn't respond, but the darkness around it seemed to shift, coiling and writhing like a living thing. I could feel its hunger, its desire to pull me into the shadows, to make me a part of the silence that it had woven around this place. But I couldn't let it win. I had to stand my ground, to reclaim the silence and turn it against the entity. "You've taken enough," I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by a growing determination. "I won't let you take me too." The entity paused, as if considering my words, and for a moment, the darkness seemed to recede. But then it surged forward, the shadows stretching out towards me like grasping hands. I could feel the cold touch of the darkness, the suffocating weight of it pressing in on me, but I refused to back down. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out the small flashlight I had brought with me on that first day, the one that had always been with me in the archive. I flicked it on, the beam of light piercing the darkness like a knife. The entity recoiled, the shadows retreating from the light, and I felt a surge of hope. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me to push forward, to drive the entity back. I stepped towards it, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, and the entity retreated, its form dissolving into the shadows. I could feel its fear now, the same fear it had instilled in me, and I pressed the advantage. "This ends now," I said, my voice ringing out in the silence. "You won't take anyone else." With a final surge of determination, I focused the beam of light on the entity, and it shrieked, a sound that echoed through the archive like the wail of 1,000 lost souls. The darkness around it writhed and twisted, pulling back as if in pain, and the entity began to dissolve, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The whispers reached a fever pitch, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices, but I held my ground, refusing to let the fear take hold. The light grew brighter, the beam cutting through the darkness, and the entity screamed one last time before it was consumed by the light, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow the world whole. I stood there, the flashlight still clutched in my hand, as the darkness receded, leaving only the dim light of the archive behind. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted, and I knew that I had done it. I had broken the cycle, defeated the entity that had claimed so many before me. But the victory was bittersweet. I could still feel the presence of the others, the ones who had been trapped here, their whispers now soft, almost mournful. I knew that I had saved myself, but what of them? Could they be saved too? The thought gnawed at me as I stood there, the silence pressing in once more. Then, from somewhere deep within the archive, I heard it, a soft, distant sound, like the rustling of pages. It was a familiar sound, comforting in its normalcy, and it brought with it a sense of peace. The whispers had faded, replaced by the gentle hum of the archive, a place of knowledge and stories, no longer a prison of shadows. I turned off the flashlight and walked towards the sound, my footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The fear that had gripped me for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. The archive was still vast, still full of secrets, but it was no longer a place of terror. I had reclaimed it, turned the silence into my ally, and now it was time to find a way out. But before I left, I had one last thing to do, one last promise to keep. The silence that had once been my tormentor now felt like a companion, guiding me through the winding aisles of the archive. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by a dim, soothing light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I knew the entity was gone, defeated by the light and my determination, but the weight of the past lingered. The whispers were gone, yet the memory of those who had been trapped here remained, their presence a haunting echo in the back of my mind. As I moved deeper into the archive, I found myself drawn to the oldest section, the place where the whispers had first begun. The shelves here were lined with ancient tomes, their spines cracked and worn, the dust of centuries clinging to their surfaces. This was where the entity had been strongest, where it had claimed its victims, including those who had disappeared before me. I reached out and pulled one of the books from the shelf, its cover rough under my fingers. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of all the souls who had been lost here. I hesitated, unsure of what I would find within its pages, but then I remembered the promise I had made to myself, to free those who had been trapped, just as I had freed myself. With a deep breath, I opened the book. The pages were filled with names, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, each one written in a delicate, flowing script. As I read through the names, I realized that these were the people who had disappeared over the years, those who had been claimed by the entity. They were all here, recorded in the archive, their lives reduced to mere entries in a ledger of the damned. But as I turned the pages, I saw something else, notes, scribbled in the margins, detailing the lives of these people before they had vanished. It was as if the archive had tried to preserve their stories, to keep their memories alive even as the entity had claimed their bodies. The thought brought a lump to my throat, and I knew what I had to do. I had to set them free. I began to read aloud, my voice steady and clear in the stillness of the archive. I spoke each name with care, honoring the lives that had been lost, and as I did, I felt a strange warmth fill the room. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting even further, and I knew that the souls of the lost were finally being released, their stories no longer trapped in the pages of this cursed archive. As I read the last name, the warmth reached a peak, filling the room with a soft, golden light. It was as if the very essence of the archive was changing, shifting from a place of darkness and despair to one of peace and remembrance. The light grew brighter, surrounding me, and for a moment, I felt as if I were floating, suspended in a sea of golden warmth. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light began to fade, and I found myself standing in the archive once more. But it was different now. The air was clean, the shelves no longer felt oppressive, and the silence was comforting, not terrifying. The whispers were gone, replaced by a gentle hum, like the rustling of pages in a library. I knew it was time to leave. I walked back through the aisles, my footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The path seemed clearer now, as if the archive itself was guiding me towards the exit. The fear that had gripped me for so long was gone, replaced by a calm resolve. I had done what I came to do, and now it was time to go home. As I reached the final set of stairs leading up to the main floor of the library, I paused and looked back one last time. The archive stretched out behind me, vast and unknowable, but no longer a place of terror. It was simply a library now, a place where stories were kept, where memories were preserved. I smiled to myself, a sense of peace settling over me, and then I turned and ascended the stairs, leaving the archive behind. When I emerged into the main floor of the library, the afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, casting warm, golden light across the polished wooden floors. The familiar smell of old books and fresh coffee filled the air, and the noise of the city outside was a comforting hum. I had survived the archive, defeated the entity, and freed the souls that had been trapped there. But more than that, I had faced my own fears, confronted the darkness within myself, and emerged stronger for it. As I stepped out into the bustling street, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The world was bright and alive, full of possibilities, and I was free to live my life without the shadow of the archive hanging over me. But even as I walked away, I knew that I would never forget what had happened in that underground labyrinth, the place where silence had once been my greatest enemy. It had become a part of me, a chapter in my own story, and though it was over now, I would carry it with me always. And as I disappeared into the crowd, I couldn't help but wonder how many other stories were out there, waiting to be uncovered. How many other places like the archive existed, hidden in plain sight, their secrets buried beneath layers of history and silence. But that was a mystery for another day. Today, I was content to simply be free.
What did you think of this story? Was it everything you expected, or did it take you by surprise? Now, let's dive into the second story and uncover even more of the unknown.
It started as a faint ring in the dead of night, a sound so subtle that I almost didn't hear it at first. The clock beside my bed glowed 2:47 a.m. in the darkened room as I fumbled for my phone, groggy and irritated. I wasn't expecting anyone to call, especially not at this hour. My hand brushed over the smooth surface of the phone, the ringing persistent, as if urging me to answer. When I picked up, I was greeted by silence. No, not silence, a deep, heavy breathing, slow and deliberate. The kind of breathing that made my skin crawl and my heart race in the quiet of the night. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky from being yanked so suddenly out of sleep. But there was no response, just more breathing. I was wide awake now, every nerve in my body tingling with unease. Who would be calling at this hour, and why? I hung up, convinced it was a wrong number or a prank, and tried to settle back into sleep. But the moment my eyes closed, the phone rang again. This time, I answered more aggressively. "Who is this?" I demanded, but once again, all I got in return was that unsettling breathing. It was slow, deliberate, and seemed almost calculated to unsettle me. I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck as I listened, too unnerved to hang up, but too frightened to say anything more. I held the phone to my ear, waiting for something, anything, beyond that horrid breathing. Then, as if sensing my growing fear, the caller finally spoke. "Do you remember the last time you saw your red sweater?" I froze. My red sweater. How could this person know about that? I hadn't seen that sweater in months, not since I'd lost it at some point during the winter. The words stuck in my throat, unable to form a coherent response, but before I could say anything, the line went dead. The sound of the dial tone echoed in the silence of my room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a rising sense of dread. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone who knew me, a friend playing a cruel joke, perhaps. But deep down, I knew that no one would call in the middle of the night just to mess with me like this. It was too personal, too eerie. The rest of the night was spent tossing and turning, my mind racing with possibilities. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that those calls were more than just pranks. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but no closer to understanding what had happened. The day passed in a blur of routine. Work was the same, my colleagues were their usual selves, but I couldn't focus on anything but that voice. That breathing. Those words. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart skipped a beat, but it was always something mundane, a message from a friend, a notification from some app. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing like the call from the night before. I told myself it wouldn't happen again, that it was just a one-time thing. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed it on the first ring, my heart pounding in my chest, but I hesitated before answering. What was I expecting? What could I possibly say to whoever was on the other end of the line? I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and then I answered. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice a mix of fear and anger. But all I got in return was that same, measured breathing. The sound sent shivers down my spine, and I felt a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was like something out of a nightmare, and I couldn't wake up. And then the voice spoke again. "I saw you at the cafe today, drinking your latte. It was too sweet, wasn't it?" My blood ran cold. I had been at the cafe earlier, just as the voice had said, and I had ordered a latte, just as they knew. But how could they have known that I found it too sweet? I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't even mentioned it to the barista. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my hands trembling as I held the phone. This was no prank. Whoever this was, they were watching me, following me. The thought sent a jolt of terror through me, and I could barely manage to hang up before I dropped the phone onto the bed, my fingers shaking. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That someone was calling me in the middle of the night, telling me things that only I should know? It sounded absurd, like something out of a horror movie, but this was real. It was happening to me. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blankets, too terrified to sleep, too afraid to turn off the light. The phone sat on the nightstand beside me, a dark, silent reminder that this wasn't over. And deep down, I knew the calls would come again. The next morning, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The events of the previous night played over and over in my mind like a broken record. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, lurking just beyond the periphery of my vision. It was as if an invisible presence was hovering over my shoulder, waiting for the right moment to strike. As I tried to go about my day, I found it impossible to focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the calls, to the voice on the other end of the line that seemed to know everything about me. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, scanning the faces of strangers for any sign that they might be the one calling me. Paranoia gnawed at my mind, feeding my growing fear. I started avoiding the places I usually went, cafes, shops, even the route I took to work. It was as if I could outrun the voice if I just changed my routine. But deep down, I knew it was futile. Whoever was calling me knew too much. They would find me no matter where I went. That night, the anxiety of waiting for the inevitable call was almost too much to bear. I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, watching the minutes tick by as the clock neared 2:47 a.m. The air in the room felt thick with tension, the silence oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. When the phone finally rang, I nearly dropped it in my haste to answer. My voice trembled as I said, "What do you want from me?" But there was no response, just that same, steady breathing that seemed to pulse through the phone like a heartbeat. I felt a surge of anger rise within me, fueled by the fear that had been building for days. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of my terror. But the only answer I received was a chilling, whispered reply. "I'm closer than you think." The words sent a cold shiver down my spine, and I felt my hands go numb as I gripped the phone. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but I was alone. The voice on the other end of the line seemed to know exactly how to push my buttons, how to unnerve me in ways that left me feeling utterly powerless. For the next few nights, the calls continued, each one more terrifying than the last. The voice began revealing details about my life that no one else should know, my childhood fears, my deepest insecurities, the secrets I had never shared with anyone. It was as if this person had a window into my soul, and they were using it to torment me. I became consumed by the calls, unable to think of anything else. My work suffered, my social life withered, and I withdrew from everyone around me. I started keeping the phone close at all times, checking it obsessively, dreading and anticipating the next call in equal measure. The line between reality and paranoia blurred as I spiraled deeper into my own fear. I began investigating on my own, desperate for answers. I checked my call logs, traced the numbers, but they always led to dead ends, unregistered numbers, blocked IDs. Nothing that could give me a clue as to who was behind this. I even considered changing my phone number, but something in me resisted. It was as if I needed to know who this was, as if uncovering the truth would somehow give me back control of my life. But the more I searched, the less sense it all made. The voice on the other end of the line seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, a ghost haunting my every waking moment. The calls weren't just a threat, they were becoming a part of me, seeping into my mind like a poison I couldn't escape. And then, one night, the voice said something that shattered the last remnants of my sanity. "I'm right outside." I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest as I rushed to the window. The street below was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. I strained to see any movement, any sign of a person lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the night and the echo of those words reverberating in my mind. The fear that had been building within me for days finally boiled over into full-blown panic. I locked all the doors, checked every window, and even grabbed a kitchen knife, clutching it tightly as I sat in the middle of my living room, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the night passed in silence, and when morning came, I was left feeling like a fool, sitting there with a knife in hand, eyes bloodshot and body trembling from the adrenaline. The voice had played me perfectly, driving me to the brink of madness without even having to show itself. But I knew now that this wasn't just a game. Whoever was behind the calls was close, closer than I had ever imagined. The morning after that last call, I felt as though I'd been hollowed out. Sleep had eluded me entirely, and the sheer exhaustion made everything around me blur. But through the haze of fatigue, a new determination settled in. The voice had crossed the line, and I couldn't let it continue tormenting me. Whoever was behind this wanted something, and I was going to find out what it was. I spent the entire day doing what I should have done from the start: research. I dove into every forum, every thread about phone harassment and strange occurrences. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In a dark corner of the internet, I found stories, accounts from others who had experienced similar calls. The pattern was always the same: calls at the same time each night, the voice that knew too much, and the escalation that drove people to the brink of insanity. But what terrified me most was how all these stories ended. Each one of the victims had disappeared, vanishing without a trace after the calls stopped. But there was one difference. In one account, buried deep in the comments, someone claimed to have survived. The post was cryptic, but it mentioned a way to fight back, a ritual involving mirrors and light, something about turning the tables on the entity that was haunting them. My hands shook as I read the details. It seemed far-fetched, almost ridiculous, but I was desperate. I had no other leads, no other options. That night, I prepared for the ritual. It involved a mirror, candles, and a circle of salt, all things I could gather easily. The post had been specific about the timing. It had to be done at exactly 2:47 a.m., the time the calls always came through. The idea was that the mirror would act as a gateway, trapping the entity on the other side, severing its connection to our world. I set everything up, my heart pounding as the clock ticked closer to the appointed time. I placed the mirror in the center of my living room, surrounded by candles, and poured the salt in a circle around me. The air felt charged with a strange energy, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath in anticipation. When the time came, I lit the candles and recited the words I had found in the post. The language was ancient, unfamiliar, but I spoke them with conviction, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. I kept my eyes locked on the mirror, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, the phone rang. The sudden sound startled me, breaking my concentration. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone, but instead of the usual dread, I felt something different, a sense of purpose. I answered, expecting the now familiar breathing, but this time, there was nothing. Just silence. I stared at the mirror, the reflection of the candles flickering ominously. The silence stretched on, unbearable, until finally, I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear, coming not from the phone, but from the mirror itself. I'm inside now. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The entity wasn't just calling me, it was trying to cross over, to manifest fully in my world. But I was ready. With a final, defiant shout, I recited the last line of the ritual, commanding the entity to be trapped within the mirror. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The candles flickered wildly, the flames stretching impossibly tall, and the air grew cold. The mirror trembled, and I could see something moving within it, a dark shape, shifting and writhing as if trying to break free. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The flames died down, the air warmed, and the mirror returned to its normal, reflective surface. The voice was gone. I collapsed to the floor, the knife slipping from my hand. The silence that followed was suffocating, but it was a different kind of silence, a peaceful one. The oppressive presence that had haunted me for weeks had vanished, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of relief. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. I knew I couldn't just leave the mirror sitting there, a potential gateway for the entity to return. The post had been clear, the mirror had to be destroyed, its shards scattered far away from each other to prevent the entity from ever reconstituting itself. I took a hammer and smashed the mirror into countless pieces, each one reflecting the candlelight in 1,000 different directions. I gathered the shards, careful not to cut myself, and placed them in separate bags, ready to dispose of them as far away from each other as possible. As I did, I realized that the nightmare was finally coming to an end. The entity was defeated, and though the scars of this experience would remain, I had survived. The voice that had haunted my every waking moment was gone, its connection to this world severed for good. I took a deep breath, the first real breath of freedom I'd had in weeks. The terror was over, or so I thought. The next morning, the sun streamed through the windows, filling my apartment with a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. The terror of the previous night seemed almost like a distant memory, something that had happened to someone else. But the shards of the mirror, still safely tucked away in separate bags, were a stark reminder of the ordeal I'd endured. I spent the day driving to various locations around the city, carefully disposing of each bag. I made sure to scatter the pieces as far apart as possible, following the instructions I'd found in the post. With every shard I left behind, I felt a little lighter, as if I were shedding the weight of the fear that had clung to me for so long. By the time I returned home, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax. I made myself a cup of tea, curled up on the couch, and let the warmth of the mug seep into my hands. The apartment was quiet, but it was a comforting silence, a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet that had haunted me before. As I sipped my tea, I reflected on everything that had happened. The calls had stopped, the voice was gone, and I had my life back. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, I had been on the brink of madness, teetering on the edge of a dark abyss. But I had survived, and that was all that mattered. I began to doze off, the events of the past few weeks catching up to me. Just as I was about to drift into sleep, the phone rang. My heart lurched in my chest, the sound jolting me upright. I stared at the phone, a cold dread creeping over me. No, it couldn't be. I had destroyed the mirror, severed the connection. The entity was gone, wasn't it? With trembling hands, I picked up the phone. I held it to my ear, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for the inevitable sound of heavy breathing, or worse, that voice whispering things only I knew. But the line was dead. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. It must have been a wrong number, a simple misdial. I set the phone back down, trying to steady my nerves. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I pushed it aside, telling myself that it was just the remnants of fear, the last traces of a nightmare that was finally over. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come, no matter how hard I tried to relax. Every sound, every creak of the apartment sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was safe. But deep down, a nagging doubt persisted. Just as I was about to give up on sleep, my phone rang again. This time, the sound pierced through the darkness like a knife. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I reached for the phone, dread twisting in my stomach. I answered, my voice barely a whisper. Hello? Silence. My heart pounded in my chest, and I strained to hear anything, even the faintest sound. But there was nothing. The silence stretched on, filling the room with a palpable tension. I was about to hang up when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't breathing or the sinister whisper I had come to fear. No, this was different. It was an echo. My own voice, distorted and distant, repeating the word I had just spoken. Hello? The echo grew louder, more insistent, as if it were coming closer. My pulse quickened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I wanted to hang up, to throw the phone across the room, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the sound of my own voice. And then, the echo stopped, replaced by a voice I recognized all too well. I'm inside now. My blood turned to ice. How? I had destroyed the mirror, followed every step of the ritual. The entity should have been trapped, banished from this world. But as the voice echoed in my ear, I realized with dawning horror what had happened. The mirror wasn't just a gateway, it was a vessel, a way for the entity to enter our world. By breaking it, I hadn't destroyed it, I had set it free. The pieces, scattered across the city, had allowed it to spread, to multiply. It wasn't gone, it was everywhere. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The voice wasn't coming from the phone, it was coming from inside my own head. The entity had found a new home, a new vessel, me. I dropped the phone, backing away in terror. But no matter how far I moved, the voice followed, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just speaking to me, it was becoming me. And as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I understood the final, cruel twist. The calls had never been about contact, they had been about control. The entity had been preparing me, wearing down my defenses, until I was too weak to resist. And now, it had succeeded. I had survived the calls, but I hadn't survived the entity. It was inside me, and there was no escape. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was my own voice, whispering from the depths of my mind. I'm inside now.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.